Hello everybody, I'm Jane. Some of you will know me from my ESOL videos from the English with Jane YouTube channel, and some of you will know me from No Tears Tuition. Today this short video is GCSE revision tips for unseen poetry. So because we're looking at the AQA exam board, our unseen poetry is on paper 2, modern texts and poetry. First of all, I always ask you to think about what you're being marked for. What is the assessment? So the assessment objectives here are assessment objective 2, which is written first because it's very important that you focus on the writer's methods, and assessment objective 1, response to the text, when you're going to write about what you understand and the ideas that relate to your question. So we need to remember our instructions. If you look at the top of this video, you will see answer one question from section A. We've already done that. Answer one question from section B. We've done that also. And answer both questions in section C. So we're going to be looking at section C. That means we need to answer both questions. As you know, section C on paper 2 is worth 32 marks. So there are two questions, 24 marks for question 1 and 8 marks for question 2. But we need to answer both questions because we need to pick up as many marks as possible. Let's have a look at the first question on this paper. And this is our question. In How to Leave the World That Worship Should, how does the poet present ideas about the way we live and work in the modern world? So, as we're used to, highlighting the key words, we'll pick out the word how, that's very important, and we'll think about the ideas about the way we live and work in the modern world. Now remember, this is a poem I haven't seen before, so I've got to think really quickly. I've worked out that perhaps I've got about 30 minutes to answer this question, so I don't want to spend more than 5 minutes thinking about my ideas. So the first thing I want you to do is read, because the first part of our work is to show what we understand. So let's read this poem. How to Leave the World That Worships Should. Let faxes butter curl on dusty shelves. Let junk mail build its castles in the hush of other people's halls. Let deadlines burst and flash like glorious fireworks somewhere else. As hours go softly by, let others curse the roads where distant drivers queue like sheep. Let emails fly like panicked tiny birds. Let phones unanswered ring themselves to sleep. Above, the sky unrolls its telegram, immense and wordless, simply understood. You've made your mark, like bird tracks in the sand. Now make the air in your lungs your livelihood. See how each wave arrives at last to heave itself upon the beach and vanish. Breathe. So don't panic when you get to the unseen poetry. Make sure you read the instructions. Make sure you read the question and the poem itself, because now you've got to think about, what do you understand? And I always ask you to look at the voice of the poem. So what are you being told? How are you being told it? Are you being instructed? Are you being advised? What is the poet telling you, if the poet is the voice? Well, when I look at this poem, I start with the title, because I always think the title tells you quite a lot. But I'm rushing in my exam now. I'm on this question and I can't work out what the title means. So after I've read the poem, I have to go back to my question and think, what I have to talk about? I have to talk about the way we live and work in the modern world. So this poem is a poem about all of the things that we either take for granted or we need or have become part of our world, and I need to decide whether the poet's saying that these are good things or these are not good things, whether the voice is suggesting that we're trapped by these things or whether there's a suggestion that we can get away. When I look at the title, I have to decide, is there anything there that can help me? Well, when I'm reading, I always pick up on the things that I do know. So I divided the title into How to Leave the World That Worships, because that made sense to me. Yes, I think our world is full of lots of things that we need, lots of things that we use, and lots of things that are there to make our life easier, but perhaps sometimes it becomes a bit overwhelming for us. And if the title of this poem is printed correctly, we'll find that the word should is in italics. Now when I see a word in italics, I know that there's something really important about that. So I've separated that word and I've thought about, what does should mean? I think should, it sounds a little bit critical. Perhaps you should do this, but you haven't. It's suggesting an idea that everything that is there, things we should do. We should answer our emails. We should make sure that we get to the place that we're headed for. Let's have a look if that makes sense in the poem itself. So, first of all, I've put a box around the nouns that I thought suggested what we do in this modern world and the way we live and work. We use faxes and junk mail and roads and emails. And then I've thought about how are these words described? Are they described in a way that's something positive, or are they described in a negative way? And I've thought about, what about the imagery that is happening there for the faxes and the junk mail and the roads and the emails? And I've noticed that there seems to be quite a lot of focus on nature, the whole idea of the sky and the birds. So once I've thought about what I understand from the poem, I have to decide what language can I see in that poem that makes a difference to me. So I've added it all together to think that this poem for me is really about how we live with lots of technology and how that technology isn't always working for us. So I was really surprised to see that faxes are on dusty shelves, because that suggests to me that that's not used as much as it ought to be. And the junk mail made me smile at the thought of the castles, because it's other people's halls. I don't want this mail in my house, because junk mail's not something we really ask for, is it? So sometimes we're getting communication that we don't want. And then perhaps for you this won't be important, but for me, I drive, so I can relate to this idea of drivers queuing like sheep. We're all trying to get somewhere, and we know that there isn't any other option but to sit and wait for that queue to change. The emails I found really interesting, because I like the idea of the tiny birds, because it wasn't just about flying through the air. It was that word panicked that made me feel that the voice of this poem was telling me something about how emails so quickly reach your inbox that sometimes it's not as easy as we would like to think to actually separate what's important and what isn't important. And I love that idea of the image of the phones that are ringing themselves to sleep. If only our phones could do that. But when you're looking for your similes or your metaphors or your personification, think about what the impact is on your understanding, what's being suggested to you. Because in the first verse, it's really suggesting that things aren't very helpful. Perhaps we need to get away sometimes from these things or use them in a different way. And in the second verse, the focus is really on the message. The message is coming from the sky. But can you see there it says immense and wordless? So what do those words mean to you? And does it help you that you've made your mark like bird tracks in the sand? But I always think that when something is in sand, it's very easily washed away. So perhaps it's not as permanent as it ought to be. So if we look at each wave that arrives on the beach and vanishes, it's consistent, it's continuous, it's something that doesn't stop. And I really like that last word there where you've got your imperative to breathe. So perhaps imperatives is something else you might look at for language impact, because your first verse is focusing on the word let, which is an imperative verb telling you, commanding you that you should do this. And then in the second verse, you've got the focus on you've, where it's now directly talking to you, and your imperative doesn't happen again until we see see. So for your understanding, you've looked at, what do I understand about this poem? What language can I pick out? You might pick out some of the easy similes like sheep, but think about, why did the poet use that simile? What is it suggesting about the drivers? And why say distant drivers when you're focusing on that language? And make sure that also fits with your structure, because after you've focused on your understanding and you've picked out your language to support your ideas, you need to think about how is it structured. Now, if you're very good at the features in the poetry and you've studied a lot about structure and you know a lot, you might have realised that this is a sonnet, and because you know it's a sonnet, you might have focused on your iambic pentameter. You might have thought about the rhythm and the rhyme scheme. You might also have thought about how that fits with your understanding, and whether you think the use of this sonnet form and iambic pentameter is to fit with the tone of the voice. Is there some suggestion that, well, if you know that sonnets usually written as love poems, then you might be thinking about the whole idea of the poet trying to help the reader, doing something positive. One of the big things that you need to look at is, how does everything fit together? When you're thinking about structure, if your mind goes absolutely blank and you can't think about the rhythm or the rhyme or what might this poem be called, what's the form, then look closely at how many stanzas do you have and how many lines are in those stanzas. But don't just write that. I want you to think about why. So if I didn't know that this was a sonnet, I could look at it and say the first stanza is 8 lines long and the second stanza is 6 lines long. But to make it work, to get some marks for structure, I'd need to really focus on the first stanza and the ideas, and how differently are those ideas explored in the second stanza. So sometimes, if it's an exam and you're nervous and you don't do as well as you think in terms of your memory and your knowledge, then just look at what's in front of you and see if you can make something out of that, because part of structure is about how the poet has put it all together. And then that follows round back to voice again, because if you're looking at the sonnet, you might suggest that the iambic pentameter is supporting conversational tone, so that there's a bigger link between the poet and the reader. Well, in the next video, we're going to look far more closely at how this all fits together. And remember, we said that you only had 30 minutes to write an answer. You focused on the question, you thought about what was important, and we have this structure here of what you understand, the language that the poet uses to present ideas, the impact that has on the reader, what you as the reader think because of this language. Do you think negatively? Do you look at the use of the nature in this poem and think that this is suggesting something to you? When you look at the first verse and it seems overwhelming, when you get to the second verse and the idea of the telegram, does that image suggest to you that perhaps looking back to what life used to be, which obviously I'll remember because I'm 59, but you won't necessarily know. It's thinking about when telegrams did exist, how was that different? How was that level of communication different? So 24 marks. In the next video, we'll talk about how we put all of the ideas together in a very quick brainstorm so that we'll be ready to write. So I'll see you in the next video. Bye now.